Hey Rebels, my name is Matthew Barton. Welcome to the Rebellion Brewing Podcast. Did you know there was a decades-long consumer boycott of Coors beer in the United States? In today's landscape, the Molson Coors is a Goliath in the beer industry. They're huge. The beer is ubiquitous. But they aren't everywhere, not exactly. In some bars in California, you won't find Coors on tap, and odds are you never will. Dr. Allison Brantley's new book, Brewing a Boycott, takes a deep dive into the Coors boycott and explains what that means for the craft beer scene today. So let's get into it. Allison, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
First off, let's start with who are you and what do you do?
So I'm a trained historian. I research U.S. history mostly, or late 20th century North American history. I'm interested in topics of labor history, consumer activism, Latinx history, as well as social movements, politics, and beer. As sort of my day job, I'm a professor of history at the University of La Verne. It's a small college in Los Angeles County. So I live in California, but I grew up in Boulder, Colorado. So I have a lot of sort of personal connections to the history of craft brewing as well.
I know you kind of touched upon it already. Specifically as it relates to this book, what kind of questions are you asking as part of your research and your field of study?
Yeah, I ask a lot of questions. I probably spend too much time asking questions and not enough time answering them. But I'm really interested in understanding how grassroots social movements come together and stay together. So in the case of the Coors boycott, which lasted from the 1950s to the 1990s, I was really interested in understanding why it lasted so long, what exactly motivated activists, and in particular, why this boycott brought together a pretty unlikely coalition of activists. So over the course of its 30 plus years, labor unions, queer activists, Latino or Mexican American activists, feminists, Black activists, environmentalists, all came together at certain points to boycott Coors beer. And so I was really interested in understanding what brought them together, why did they stay together, and how can unlikely coalitions function in this movement and other movements. And so I'm really coming at this story from an interest in the grassroots and understanding what it was like for everyday activists to build this boycott and sometimes face pretty devastating failures in the process. And I was lucky that this was a story that intersected with beer, so I could also think about what it was like to work in the brewing industry in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s in the United States, which looks different from much of the brewing industry today.
One of the things that I took away from your reading, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is labor in the United States, the labor movement as relates to beer, it kind of got squished. And I don't know if it's ever recovered or it's not been a straight line anyways.
Yeah, absolutely. I think starting in the 1950s in the case of Coors, there were a lot of sort of legal reasons and economic pressures that really weakened the labor movement in the United States. So Coors, for example, here I'll just talk about the flagship brewery in Golden, Colorado. It had been unionized on and off and then was unionized in the 1930s after the end of Prohibition by a United Brewery Workers Union, Local 366. And in general, this was a union that was kind of at times seen as a company union, like it was pretty conservative or moderate in terms of its activism. But over time, especially into the post-World War II period, this union tried to be more militant, to win more benefits, to have better protections on the job. They had a lot of problems with sort of inconsistent shifts, for example, especially in peak production seasons like of the spring. And they found it harder and harder to make any big gains against the company in the late 20th century. And this ended up being true for a lot of labor unions in the United States as the politics of the US became more conservative and it was easier for businesses to get away with union busting. And so In this particular case, the unions at Coors had to think bigger than just localized labor action like a strike. And so they turned to the consumer boycott as one way to try to build power in this place of, yeah, as you put it, like squishing. There's fewer opportunities, so they had to be kind of creative in what they did.
When I was going to school and I was looking at these pieces, I was looking at it through the lens of political science. And we were studying the labor movements and comparing and contrasting Canada and the United States. You can't escape what's happening in the United States. And I think a lot of it just spills across our border into our media, into our popular culture. So
Right.
what was happening in the United States, a lot of it, if not directly impacted, echoed into our labor markets and what was going on with workers here and attitudes towards taxation and workers' rights, but also gay, lesbian, and I would say more First Nations rights rather than Latino. I guess I wanted to come back and to circle around to the idea of these are very separate groups. And maybe they overlap, but how did you connect these different groups? Like when you say blue collar, or when I say blue collar labor union guys, I don't traditionally think of blue collar labor guys who like are working with their hands and fists as maybe having so much to do with LGBTQ or Chicano politics or priorities. How did that work?
Yeah, that I think you're absolutely right. This is very much an unlikely coalition that comes together. And even at the time, folks who are engaged in these movements are sort of surprised by the fact that they're kind of coming together on this issue. The one big thing that brings them together is a common enemy. The Coors Brewing Company and the Coors family end up being an enemy or an enemy or an institution that really unites a lot of people on the progressive left in the United States. And they come together against Coors because of allegations of anti-unionism at the brewery, allegations of discrimination on the job. These are substantiated allegations. In the 1950s and 1960s, the company was really only hiring, white straight men into most of its production lines. And then the third thing that united a lot of these groups was the fact that the Coors family themselves was kind of a notorious right-wing or conservative political actor in the United States. So the family used a lot of its profits from its beer industry or from its beer production to fund conservative movements in the United States, and conservative movements that kind of looked broadly at North America, trying to create really business-friendly environments. So this would have impacted consumers and activists in Canada and in Mexico. And so a lot of activists in the United States, in a period when, as you noted, like labor is being squished, activism is kind of maybe coming to a little bit of a point of feeling stalled after the radical 1960s. Coors offers a really easy target, a target that's recognizable. The name is on the can. And this is a good way for people to come together. And so the common enemy kind of brings these groups together, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be like in solidarity with each other. And so on the ground in local places, like in San Francisco, there are efforts by union activists like beer drivers who were unionized with the Teamsters. They did active outreach to gay and lesbian activists in San Francisco, realizing that they actually needed these coalitions that were unlikely in order to actually build power. And so they did things like show up at each other's meetings, ask for support in a variety of ways, and give support. So it's this really kind of pragmatic and reciprocal relationship. And so that's one of the things that I really love about this Coors boycott story, is that in a period of kind of declining activism maybe, or in communities where we might not have seen overlapping alliances, they're coming together because the company and the family itself represent so many big problems or challenges for progressives in the late 20th century.
I guess the next question for me is, I hadn't heard of this boycott until I listened to the podcast from Beer Advocate. And it seems like if there's so many of these groups coming together, why wasn't it in the broader public consciousness, say, now?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, I didn't know about the boycott until I read about it when I was in graduate school. I grew up in Colorado, which is Coors's home turf, right? And so you drive by the brewery all the time when you go skiing. There are lots of places in Colorado named after the family. And so I was also really shocked that this like 30-year movement wasn't more in the public eye. And I think there are a couple explanations for that. I mean, one, the fact of the matter is Coors survived this boycott. They definitely had some challenges in figuring out how to respond to boycotters, but the company became really quite good at community relations and community outreach and PR. And so they were kind of able to reclaim the narrative from these boycotters to actually say by the 1990s, look at us, we're a socially responsible company. We're providing same-sex healthcare coverage for gay couples. They're doing all these things that are responding to boycotters, but also kind of muting the conversation about the boycott. So I think that that's sort of a classic kind of, corporate power history in which the corporation in the end is able to sort of tell the story. And we can talk more about like, does that mean the boycott failed? I don't really think that it's a completely a story of failure. I think the other thing is that this boycott is really localized. So it starts in Colorado, it extends across the West because that's the only place that Coors distributes. For a long time, Coors's distribution was limited because they didn't pasteurize, they cold filtered their beer. The boycott was really only going to be in the places where the beer was available because you can't boycott something that's not there. So I think those are kind of two reasons for this. I also think that this boycott just because it was spread all over the place and it kind of ebbed and flowed over the course of numerous decades, the story hasn't been fully captured yet. And so that was one of the things I really wanted to do in this project. And I kept being surprised at how long it lasted and where it popped up. And so I'm really excited to be able to tell the story in a more complete way through the book.
The takeaway I got from your book was, like you said, will the boycott or did the boycott win? And the thing I got out of it was it's not a simple answer.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's like the hardest question that I had to contend with in writing the book was because there are a couple places where the boycott just it doesn't succeed. In sort of the labor story, Local 366, the brewery workers at Coors, they eventually went on strike in 1977, and they really pushed the boycott heavily. But they were on strike for almost 2 years, and after that time, their union was decertified, which meant it was voted out of the union by replacement workers. So the union died. So that is a clear-cut story of failure for that union. But when I talked to the folks who were in the union, who had been working on the brewery floor, who then went out across the West and like organized people in California to get them to boycott, they don't even view it as a failure. They see their movement as one of solidarity building, as opening up conversations about corporate America, about politics and corporate money. They were really pleased with the coalitions they were able to build. And so it made me think when talking to them and researching in their papers that it's not enough to just say, oh, this boycott failed and so it wasn't important. And maybe that's why the story hadn't been told as much before, because it lasted a really long time. And in the process, it changed the people who were involved in it. And it also changed the company. The Coors Brewing Company was undoubtedly different at the end of the boycott than it was at the beginning. And so, yeah, it's a complicated answer because sometimes depending on who you talk to, they do see it as a failure. Some people really see it as a successful movement, but it's a kind of qualified success.
When you talk about these pieces, you talk about change. I kind of want to help my audience understand that Coors isn't just Coors anymore. It was Coors, and then it was Miller Coors, and now it's Molson Coors. And that evolution of what it means to be a brewery or a company, it muddies the waters, I think. And that's was in my mind percolating at the back of my thoughts is like maybe that's why more people don't know, because they still don't really understand what Molson Coors means. And in a Canadian
Hmm.
context, Molson is one of the biggest brewers. Molson
Right.
has been dueling with Labatt's in the Canadian context,
Okay.
whereas I look at the United States and I say, oh, it's been Coors versus Anheuser-Busch, and then that was all happening prior to the explosion of craft.
Hmm.
I wanted to, I was wanting to ask you, how do you track this change, or how do you hold a company to account, or how do you keep the story straight when it changes like this?
Yeah, it's a difficult task, and in some ways I didn't have to face it head on because my interest was at the level of activism, more so than the corporation itself. But Coors is a really good example of the evolution of the brewing industry, I think, in North America in a general way, because it started in 1873 as a family owned small brewery. It served only Colorado and sort of extended mountain towns in Colorado for some time. The brewery survived Prohibition by pivoting to malted milk products, and then also expanding a porcelain product factory, which is still quite prominent. And then in the post World War II period, the brewery itself is engaged in the beer wars and consolidation, and they're fighting against Miller. At the time, Schlitz was one of the top 4 or 5, as well as Anheuser-Busch. And this is what it's actually that those evolutions or changes in that particular brewery and in the industry made it kind of hard to understand the impact of the boycott, actually, because this is a period in which Coors is fighting against all of these other big breweries for market share, and they're crowding out. They're basically, all of these small breweries are dying off, and then you just have this massive consolidation, which then, as you mentioned, by the 1990s and 2000s extends across the globe, and you really only have a couple of key players. And I think because of those changes and the massive size of some of these brewing companies, I wouldn't even call them brewing companies anymore because of the diversity of their portfolios. A small movement like the boycott seems like a little blip, but I also think that it shaped Coors, and then Miller Coors and Molson Coors, into a company that is pretty socially responsible compared to some of its competitors.
Right. How did the boycott change the company? What were some of the outcomes?
Hmm. I think some of the most significant outcomes come in the form of community outreach or corporate social responsibility. I mean, that's the term they always used in the 1980s. But there was a significant effort by Mexican American or Chicano activists in Colorado to target the company because they weren't really hiring people of color at parity with their local population percentages. So Mexican Americans and Latinos are kind of constantly pushing against the company to improve its hiring, improve its community relations. Same goes for queer activists. And at first, the company kind of ignores these efforts, or I don't think the company had really seen that there was a consumer market out there beyond white middle class families, to be honest. But because of these boycott efforts, these different communities and consumer markets become visible to the company. So the company only really sees Mexican American consumers by their lack of consumption. And the company only really starts to see, oh, there are like gay and lesbian consumers out there that we can market to because of this boycott. And so the company starts to engage a lot more in segmented marketing in the 1980s and 1990s, and they really expand their portfolio of community projects, funneling, like in the mid 1980s, hundreds of millions of dollars back into local communities. They funded AIDS research in the 1980s. In the 1990s, they started offering same sex healthcare coverage. And a lot of boycotters would say basically, like, part of my French, they would be like, that's bullshit. Like, this is just them like buying us off. And I think that is to an extent true. But the company made all these good faith efforts to undercut the boycott, and therefore kind of made themselves into a more responsible or community engaged corporation. And then they set a standard for the rest of the industry. So because they started doing that, then Miller and Anheuser-Busch follow suit. right? And so I think we see the brewing industry evolving in part because of this boycott, in part because of context. And now, I mean, I think quite frankly, some of these big breweries are better at dealing with diversity and equity challenges than some small breweries because they have experience doing that. And I think in part we can attribute that to the challenges of the boycott and activism targeted at a number of these breweries, but especially Coors.
There's so many great things I want to unpack in there. From a perspective of corporate social responsibility, would you say Molson Coors was kind of like the tip of the spear compared to the other breweries? They were leading, they were in front.
No, I don't think I would say that. I think that they started setting a standard in certain areas, but all of these breweries are facing pressure from activists in a variety of ways. Anheuser-Busch also, there were various boycott efforts against it, especially by Jesse Jackson and something called Operation Push, which is affiliated with the civil rights movement. I think Coors was heralded by the media at the time as being a leader in the field and maybe the tip of the spear, but I don't know that I don't know that that's the full, story of cause and effect, I guess. I don't know that I would want to attribute that all to Molson Coors because I think a lot of this is happening across the industry, but Coors had to be very open in what they were doing in order to combat the boycotters. So they were often much more public about their kind of internal efforts at community engagement, at fixing some employment practices and that kind of stuff.
I guess the question that follows for me is, does the left hand know what the right hand is doing for the company? Because on the one hand, they're making these changes and efforts and outreach towards LGBTQ and these certain groups, but then you have the Coors family, and there's documented on Open Secrets and stuff like that, showing their continued donations to conservative movements and Trump and stuff like that,
yeah.
Which really undercuts the other stuff they're trying to do, and it kind of, I don't want to say hypocrisy, but it sounds like there's a disconnect there.
Yeah, absolutely. So boycotters, especially into the 1990s and even the early 2000s, the boycott was really strong in the queer community because they were basically saying, look at this. Like, there's even some visual I think I have in the book that's like, when you drink Coors, it's trickle down homophobia, because they may say that they're doing these good things, but the Coors family and some of their private foundations continue to support sort of Christian family values type organizations, which are very, especially in the 1990s in the US, they're pursuing these anti-gay kind of culture wars agendas. The company itself would say, oh, the family is actually not involved in leadership of, our company. They're only own some shares of the stock. So they're using their own private family money to do these things. And there were definitely some moments, I think it was like 2003, Pete Coors, one of the grandsons of sort of the big name guys in the 70s, he ran for Senate in Colorado and had anti-gay marriage on his platform. And the company actually came out and said, we don't agree with him on that. So that for the company, I think they have to tread a careful line of trying to distance themselves from the family's political activities. But yeah, for most activists, they would say it doesn't matter. The family is making its money from the company one way or another. And so if you really care about these issues, this was the argument they always made to people, you should not be giving your money to this company because eventually it will be turned around against you.
That piece, I like that idea. I want to explore further where it kind of, we talk about the consumer boycott as a tool to kind of change companies or push back. And when I said labor movement's been squished, and we see consumers in Canada as well pushing back on companies like the chicken one, Chick-fil-A. I've never had it,
yeah.
But I recall very popularly in the media, people were saying don't support them, or the Hobby Lobby guys.
Yeah.
And why is it boycotts are the thing that's being done as opposed to other kinds of ways to encourage companies to change?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I think that the thing that I really appreciate about consumer boycotts is that there's a very low bar of entry. So it's easy to personally engage in a boycott because it doesn't ask you to do much more than sacrifice something. If you never go to eat chicken sandwiches, Matthew, boycotting Chick-fil-A is not really that much of a sacrifice. But if you're saying, okay, I'm not going to actively go there, you're also part of a broader movement. So there's something appealing about boycotts. That's why consumer boycotts have had such a lasting presence in especially US history. I mean, think from the Boston Tea Party to today, there have constantly been boycotts of one shape or another. The problem with that sort of low bar of entry is that sometimes people don't know why they're getting involved in the boycott and they don't really understand the stakes of it. It becomes kind of performative, especially, this is one of the
Selectivism?
critiques. Yeah, right. Or like Instagram activism, where you can put it on your feed and say, hey, I'm boycotting SoulCycle, which was like a year ago, the fitness company, or boycotting Amazon, today because of XYZ. So I think the thing about boycotts is they have to be well organized. And yes, they're kind of easy to turn to, but if they're not organized carefully and the messaging isn't clear, they look like sort of lazy activism when they can be a lot more than that.
The other piece to that says to me, if I'm a customer and I'm pissed off at a company and I don't want to buy their stuff, if another small company or different company comes in and they maybe more represent what my political beliefs are, or they at least don't offend who my personal identity and my political beliefs, that's an opportunity to do some business. And I want to be so bold as to say I think anti-corporatism, that undercurrent of skeptical anti-establishmentism, is baked into craft beer culture. When you come to a craft brewery, you as a consumer, you as the person, are saying, I'm choosing to pay a little bit of a premium price, but I'm attaching my identity and my politics to a product that is different.
Right.
Not just in quality, but something that there's something else going on. Does that make sense? I'm kind of messing
Yeah.
up my.
Yeah, well, it's like what people call a boycott, right? So you're not boycotting, but you're actively using your money in more productive ways. I think there have been activists as of late who really advocate more for that than just a boycott, because maybe you're making more of a difference by moving your money to somewhere else. But then again, the question is, what's the purpose at the end of the day? Is it just so you feel better about yourself? Or do you imagine yourself as part of a bigger movement of, craft brewing, aficionados who want to change the industry more generally? And so then what does it mean to be engaged in that kind of consumer activism?
I know I didn't send you this article, but a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, there was a brewery in Alberta, which is west of where I am geographically. I'm in Saskatchewan. And they got in trouble for political donations to a candidate who is considered to be more radically right-wing and mired in some controversies. And consumers started emailing them, flooding their social media, coming at them very aggressively and saying, I'm never going to drink your beer again. You're offensive. You don't support my beliefs. And the owner of the brewery came out and he said, here's a list of everywhere I've ever donated to and everyone I've ever donated to and the why. And it showed that across the spectrum of what we would call left to right, this is a soapbox for me to stand on. I view left-right paradigms as very, very primitive and crude way of describing where people sit politically. I think it's much more complex than that. But for him, he was trying to show that he wasn't just like a right-wing kook pandering to a right-wing kook. He was saying, look, I donate money for different reasons. And he's kind of showing I'm playing a game to get political things done. And I see the parallels in the U.S. and in your book between the blowback he received and then the way he reacted to your book. And it blew my mind because I'm reading your book and then all this stuff explodes in Alberta. I'm like, oh, okay. It's all connected.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Coors did the same thing. There were two brothers in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s, Bill and Joe, who, had led the brewery division and some of the other divisions. And Joe Coors was a kind of notoriously conservative one. And Bill Coors, every once in a while, the company would kind of bring him out because, for example, he supported the Equal Rights Amendment in the United States, which was this effort to add basically a gender neutral amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And Joe and the right wing conservatives are really against it, but they're like, oh, look, we have, the other guy has this different interest. I think in some ways that just serves to confuse consumers, or you can find any point of contention with a company. And so I think maybe my takeaway from this is like, it's important to offer critiques as a consumer because you have power as a consumer. So you can say to a company, well, we don't like what you're doing with your money. But I still sort of say, if you're going to organize a consumer boycott or consumer action, it's not just about the immediate reaction, but it's about being intentional in that activism. And what are you going to do with it? And what results do you hope to see? Is it just with this brewery in Alberta? Do people just want to see him stop making donations? Do they want to see the company go out of business? I think there are some conversations to be had about like, if we're going to do a boycott, what do we want to actually happen at the end of this thing? And I think sometimes that conversation is left out, and then it leaves the boycott really open to critique that it's just kind of emotional or reactive or a one-off kind of thing.
Looking at your book and based on some of the experiences I've seen with businesses today, it seems like some people will never be satisfied. They could get everything from their list of demands, but what they really want is to see you ground into paste and lit on fire and thrown down the garbage chute and forgotten forever, or canceled. I hate that loaded term, but they just want to see you destroyed. Even though they got the apology they wanted, or they got the money, or the cause, or maybe they even changed hearts and minds of the company or the people that work there, it's still not enough for them. They want like retribution.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is, where do we go from that?
That's a good question. I don't know. But it's true. I think in the case of Coors, like, there are some people who just wanted revenge on the company, and this was a scorched earth kind of thing because they hated the company so much because of their role as an employer, because of their role in politics. And the big problem with that in this particular case is it divided boycotters against each other. So in part, that was why the boycott kind of faded away. It didn't see maybe all the results people wanted, because then there's just infighting. If you decide to take a settlement with the company because you see that they've improved, but then an organization across town from you is calling you a sellout, then the problem becomes sort of this internal division over priorities and weakens the movement in general. So, I mean, maybe I sound like a broken record, but one of the things that comes out of this particular case study for me is that you have to be clear about the practical goals of a movement. Certainly, there's much more. There's a lot more to a movement than just winning a list of demands, but a movement can't go on forever. And so how do you want it to end? Do you want it to end in this like acrimonious debate, or do you want to end when you know that you've settled something collectively? That's why I think like local coalitions around, say, like school board issues end up being pretty productive, because they're small movements that have a clear endpoint and they're not dragged out into this whole kind of bitter thing. But increasingly, I think there's so much bitterness in politics in Canada and the US that like it's hard to imagine how we could have sort of a movement that would end agreeably for everybody.
I guess the next piece I wanted to bug you was, what can people take away from your work? What is the value of understanding this story?
Mm-hmm. I think so the first thing for me, the value of the story is that I think that it's a really exciting and engaging story of solidarity building in a time that there wasn't that much attention to coalitions, or there was this belief that everybody's kind of divided against each other. So, I mean, maybe to go back to my previous point, we feel like we live in a moment of division now. And I think folks in the 1970s and 80s felt the same. But there was a lot of effort to work together across different lines, racial, ethnic, sexual, gendered, and even a little bit of political to actually make change. And so I think there's sort of that inspiring piece of it. And I am optimistic about coalition building. And even though it's a qualified optimism, I'm optimistic about what boycotts can do. I think they can be really useful tools. But I also think that there's a lesson here about the limits of grassroots organizing, because they can only go so far. There's the problem of internal division, like we discussed, but in the face of really wealthy, powerful corporate or political interests, sometimes grassroots activism it can only go so far. It can't radically change a system. And I think for me as a historian, it's hard to draw like sort of direct lessons or, to relate the past to the present. But I think that the lesson there is that if you're engaged in organizing a movement or you want to change an industry, you can do all that you can try everything and maybe you won't succeed. And it's not necessarily about the internal failures of your movement, but it's about the pressures from outside. And, one of the critiques of the Coors boycott movement is that like they didn't do enough or they didn't, like they just picked a tactic that didn't work. And I think that it's also important to shift the conversation to sort of the external forces that make it harder and harder to do that kind of organizing in like, a neoliberal kind of corporate political environment that we start to see emerging in the past 40 years or so.
I think the big elephant in the room to compare and contrast Canadian and American experiences is healthcare.
Yeah.
You mentioned when Coors started to offer health benefits for gay people, that just wasn't part of the conversation here in Canada because you have healthcare.
Right.
But I did see that kind of tension play out, compare and contrast between the stimmy checks and what we had, which was called CERB during the pandemic. So people were able to access government relief and they got $2,000 Canadian in payments over time to help them if their job had been affected or messed up by the pandemic. My wife's American, so even though we live in Canada, she did receive a stimmy check, and it had like Trump's signature on it. So it kind of like we saw this and we're like, this is totally different from the Canadian experience, but we were still touched and impacted by what was going on in the U.S. And the takeaway, when you say what can people do or what can broader groups do, the last labor force piece that I looked at for the U.S. was saying about less than 10% of the total working population is union, whereas in Canada it's closer to about between 35 and 40%. And those institutions create a different impact on what tools workers have and what are the upward pressures on wages or what protections they have. And I kind of wanted to say, I thought your book, and you could tell me I'm wrong, I thought your book was advocating for a framework for organized labor to act within. Like, it's much more Wild West in the United States. And the takeaway I took was, let's build a football field and have referees and make it robust and make sure the players aren't getting face masked on their way down the field, and swap out the players for labor and make the referees fair. If business and labor have these competing interests, create a framework for them to at least just exist civilly and not grind one side into paste.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that is, the biggest challenge for organized labor in the United States is that theoretically, a framework like that does exist. We have the National Labor Relations Act from 1935, and then the board that oversees unfair labor practices. But business has become very good at figuring out how to drag out any of these kinds of conflicts, or they can pay a fine. This is the thing with Amazon right now, the efforts to organize. Amazon has engaged in unfair labor practices, and they get a slap on the wrist and they drag it out and they kind of weaken an organizing drive. And so one of the things we see with the efforts to organize at Coors and to maintain a union is that the company's outsized political influence impacts its own workers by giving them less actually to negotiate for. And so the thing about, say, the healthcare coverage at Coors is that a union doesn't win that. The company decides when they want to give it to their workers. So it's kind of this paternalistic model where the company can decide what kind of benefits they will bestow upon their workforce. And they can use that to keep their workforce conservative, to say, oh, you should be so grateful that we will give you these things. And so there's not a lot of equity across the market at all. I mean, and a lot of historians and labor experts in the US say, like, part of the problem actually with healthcare and weak unions in the US is because unions advocated in the 1950s for their employers to handle healthcare rather than pushing the state to offer it so that it's universally accessible. And so the unions ended up kind of making these conservative negotiations with companies, and I couldn't really think radically because they were focused on these kind of bread and butter issues. And then when they fail to secure those, it makes unions look less attractive to many workers in the US.
Circling back to how this all plugs into craft beer and the opportunities that it offers for new young breweries to come up, you did mention earlier that some small craft breweries aren't doing it as good as the bigs because they haven't got the institutions or people or structures in place to protect their workers or offer these same pieces. I've had Ren Navarro on the podcast. She works for Beer Diversity, and she's trying to encourage businesses to think about how to ensure that they are a fair place to work, that they have a diverse workforce, how to appeal to consumers who are diverse, and not just be slacktivists, but walk the walk in addition to the talk. I liked seeing Ren's work, and I like to see that conversation ongoing. But ultimately, I wanted to give the floor to you and say, what have I missed, or what has been overlooked you think is a real opportunity for people?
Overlooked in the industry right now, or?
In craft beer. In terms of where it's going and where it's been.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so as we were discussing there, I think craft beer has this anti-corporate stance and wants to set itself apart from big breweries. But I think there are some examples to be drawn from the experiences of big breweries. That's not to say you have to make yourself into like a corporate factory. But the thing with, when I look at like the history of Coors was white and male by design. They kept people of color out of the brewery, or they would hire them into janitorial positions. For a long time, they didn't have a women's bathroom on the brewery floor. And so they created an industry that they saw as pretty exclusively masculine, right? And exclusively white. And then they marketed towards those groups. And so it eventually became almost naturalized that that was who beer was for. That this was who worked in the industry, and then beer was a guy's drink, and sometimes your wife would pick it up from the grocery store, and it became seen that way. But it was not natural in terms of that development, and it became sort of exclusive by design. And activists had to push back against a brewery like Coors to really open it up and change the conversation. And it's still an ongoing process. And I think one of the big lessons here is to look at all of our industries. I mean, for me in, say, academia, which sometimes seems kind of open or progressive, but there are a lot of institutional histories that keep different stories out. And so how can we look at the history of related institutions to look for examples of how to push forward, either as activists or as people who own breweries, I mean, what can you do to open up conversations, to think more broadly, and to understand that it's not natural that some industries look the way they do, and there are a lot of different ways we can open up conversations.
If people want to find your book, they want to sink their teeth into these ideas and learn more, where can they go?
Yeah, so my book is available for sale on all major book platforms, and sometimes in physical bookstores, but not as much as I would like. You can buy it on Amazon for sure, but if you want to avoid Amazon, the publisher itself, University of North Carolina Press, has it available for sale. So you can read about the Coors boycott there. But I've also done a number of different podcasts over the past couple of months. I really like the podcasting format. And one that I think did a really fantastic job with this story was the Good Beer Hunting source material podcast. Brian Alberts and Holly Reagan did a fantastic job and brought in a lot of audio from the boycott movement, which obviously I couldn't bring to the book. So that's another place to learn about the boycott in its sort of broad scope. And then I would love it if people would read my book, because there's a lot of really funny and fantastic stories about the boycott in there as well.
Allison, thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was fun.
Rebels, thanks for listening today. If you have any questions or comments about this episode, be sure to join us on our brand new Facebook group page, The Rebellion Brewing Podcast. I'm going to include links in the show notes so you can find Allison's books online and also her work. I'm also proud to let you know that we're members of the Saskatchewan Podcast Network. It's a one-stop shop for tons of locally produced shows from across our province. You can find them at saskpodcastnetwork.com. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Untapped so you don't miss out on the latest in Sask craft beer news. Thank you for joining the Rebellion.